Thank you very much for allowing us to come and speak at this conference. We are thoroughly enjoying the different presentations and networking with you. I was also very honoured to be in the presence of a number of Olympic competitors, something I always aspired to. As a younger fellow, I was a swimmer, a competitive swimmer, and I still do that now. It's called Masters Swimming. And there's two rules that I've noticed about changing from competing at a younger age to an older age. And the first is that when you were younger, you never wanted to be beaten by somebody younger than you. And then in Masters, you're in great fear of being beaten by someone older than you. And one thing I noticed too, the older I get, the faster I used to be. So, intellectual property and sports. I'm going to talk about the three general areas where we've got intellectual property and sports, and that's in major sporting events, in the broadcasting of sporting events, and IP and sports-related commodities in everyday life. That's clothing and sports equipment. And what are the risks and the threats? And importantly, what sort of interventions can we do to try and resolve those issues? What works and what doesn't work? But first of all, who are we? The Intellectual Property Office. Yes, we're a government department and we're responsible for issuing rights. We're also responsible for the policy and government policy around that. But one of the important things that our mandate is to do anything to protect, that's useful to protect intellectual property rights. And it's a complex enforcement environment between the private and the public sector. So the Intellectual Property Office said, we can have the best issuing office in the world, but what if you can't look after those rights? So that's an important part, and it's invested in having an intelligence capability that works across all those different agencies in order to protect intellectual property rights. So we've become the competent authority for IP crime. And we have a criminal intelligence unit dedicated to dealing with IP crime and enforcement. And like anywhere, there's a complex law enforcement landscape. At a local level, we have Trading Standards, which is a unique organisation. It's very locally based, but covers the whole country, and is a prosecuting authority. It's kind of similar to market surveillance authorities, but it's got quite a lot more power. The police are interested in intellectual property crime. They're not the major lead in that, but they clearly deal with some of the fraud offences, and they will deal with intellectual property crime. We had such a problem with online enforcement that we invested and financed a dedicated police online unit, which I'll talk more about later. Clearly at our borders, our customs authorities, which is Revenue and Customs and Border Force, have a key role. Our National Crime Agency is responsible for delivering the government's strategic objectives on serious and organised crime. And the work that we've been able to demonstrate with good intelligence is that it is a strategic priority. It's a harm to the UK. So intellectual property is part of the organised crime strategy. You have medicines and food regulatory authorities, which is a whole range of enforcement. And so the list goes on, Europol and Interpol and OLAF and UIPO. We have attachés in China, in the Southeast Asian area, in India and Brazil. We have a huge private sector capability. There is no other commodity and criminal area where there's such a broad school of enforcement capability. And it all works differently at a local level, at a provincial and regional level, and a national level. And it's our job to coordinate that and to support all those different organisations and to understand how those different tasking processes work. And we do that by having an overall enforcement strategy. We're just about to renew that for the UK, which will set out our agenda for the next 5 years. Every year we construct an IP crime report, which is our best assessment between ourselves, all our law enforcement partners and our private sector partners. What do we think the problem really looks like in the UK? And that report really sets the agenda and is a critically important assessment. But we have great political support too. We have a dedicated intellectual property minister. So there's a real focal point in government for leadership around IP as a problem. It's easily dismissed. And you see how many ministries are involved. Where is that owned? Well, we're fortunate in having an IP minister who takes a keen interest in both the issuing of rights, the policy around rights, and the enforcement of IP rights. And what we've developed is a really simple, straightforward plan of how to deal with intellectual property infringement that becomes criminal conduct. And we call it Project Poise. In some places it's called Follow the Money, but really it's a breakdown of the supply chain of both the legitimate and the illegal supply. So we analyse that. How do you get from ordering the goods right the way through to delivery and retail? How does the illegal supply compare to the legal supply? If you don't know what the legal supply chain is, how can you then compare where the illegal supply? And of course, they follow the same pathways. Manufacture, usually in places that have got access to low-cost production, high-volume production, with access to shipping. And yes, China is very high amongst those, but it's not unique. But volume-wise, that's it. So in any strategy that you've got, you must include, well, what are we going to do in relation to the manufacture in China? Now, that principle holds good wherever that may be. And they will use, in the illegal supply, all sorts of legal services. Like, it's got to go in a container, it's got to go on a ship, and it's got to go through. That's not intrinsically illegal. So those intermediaries and those facilitators are really important. They will set up businesses. And to set up a business, you need to form a company. You will need an accountant. You will need bank accounts. So all of these facilitators and enablers are potential opportunities for us to intervene. So we have to invest time and money understanding how it works. And then we can develop interventions that disrupt it, because for sure we cannot enforce our way out of counterfeits as the sole tactic. There's plenty more counterfeits where they came from. We can seize as much as we want. So we've got to use our enforcement resources really wisely and really carefully. So what services do they use? Well, it's not immediately apparent, and we've spent a lot of time investing and analysing how that works. So you'll see at the ordering stage, what can we do to disrupt that? At the manufacturing stage, what can we do? Well, at the manufacturing stage, if it's in China, it means building relationships with the Chinese authorities. It's a huge place. I've been to China, and everything is on a scale that's unbelievably large. But it's changing. China is developing its own intellectual property, so it has to start protecting its property, and it has to start protecting our intellectual property. But we can't tell China to stop, to just solve our problem. We have to enter in a relationship where we can demonstrate that we're suppressing the demand for it. So learning how to engage with our Chinese colleagues, both at the customs stage and at the police stage, is really important. And it's beginning to happen. At the shipping stage, at the moment, it's pretty easy to get things through. The work that you have to do and the declarations you have to do on forms are not very stringent, and you can do point-to-point declarations, so you don't really know who the consignee is, just details about a freight forwarder. So we're exploring how we can engage with shipping companies without them having to take full legal responsibility for that. How can we work to show cooperation? And that will mean working with the industry on analysing their logistical data and comparing that to shipping data to see where there are a mismatch, and then raising an investigation and an inquiry. But what we noticed on that was that first, nobody's ever told a shipping company that they were shipping counterfeits. So there's a communication issue there between different players in the supply chain. And once it gets into the country and gets through the border, it's transported away. How do we map that? How do we trace that? How do we identify where the hotspots? Because there are hotspots. So my organisation does an analysis of everything that's detained as a counterfeit at UK borders and maps that out in terms of destination. And you'll see later on in this presentation that they keep leading to the same hotspots, which helps us prioritise where we're going to work. You'll have seen everywhere in Europe an explosion in self-storage. I don't think it existed 10, 15 years ago. It's everywhere now. We invested in finding out what goes on at self-storage places, and quite a lot of them were being used as intermediary warehousing and storage for counterfeits, and some of them were actually counterfeit marketplaces. And by working with that industry, it was ready to cooperate and to engage with brands, with law enforcement, to self-regulate so that they would follow a code of conduct that allowed us to identify where the rogue self-storage places were. That's the sort of plan now where we can interrupt at the storage level. Where you do the enforcement at the marketplace, you're only dealing with the front men. We're now trying to get behind the structured process. And in those wholesale and retail places, what's going on there? What you see on the street is not what's going on behind. How do we get into that level? How do we infiltrate that more structured layer? Well, yes, we can do that by raids, but we need to engage with other areas of criminality. It's no coincidence that we find labels, thousands of labels coming in, and then thousands of unmarked goods, which are going to be joined up. Now, they're not going to be joined up in health and safety conscious workplaces that respect human rights. They're going to be joined up in sweatshops. They're going to be joined up in places where they're abusing human beings, they're trafficking human beings. So we need to make sure that we understand how that works, not just from the commodity of intellectual property, but from other areas of criminality where there will be intelligence, where there will be potential to intervene. And that's exactly what we find. They're the same people. When we investigate those people from the IP perspective, they're the same people who are moving human beings. They're the same people that are moving drugs. They're the same people that are abusing immigration rules. Intellectual property crime is just something else that they happen to do. So, on the major sporting events, clearly London Olympics was a real highlight. We've got Andalib will talk to you later about how those rules were done in terms of brand protection, but there were some really fascinating and really interesting lessons to learn from the London Olympics. First and foremost, we virtually had no counterfeits. Now, in every previous Olympic, there was a real problem with counterfeits. With World Cup football, there were problems with counterfeits. We had virtually none. Now, why? But that's because of the proactive protection. But there are other important things. We dealt very, very assertively with ticket touts. Does that translate? Okay, ticket touts, the illegal selling of tickets. Those people were dealt with proactively by a dedicated police unit within the Commonwealth, within the Olympic organising group. I'm as sure as they can be, and in the debrief we discussed this, I'm as sure as it can be that by dealing with the ticket touts, they were the same people that would have dealt with the counterfeits. They would have created that demand for counterfeits, and they would have supplied the counterfeits. But because they were dealt with so assertively for the tickets, they were nowhere near the Olympics. There were none of these sellers of scarves and tat to do with counterfeits. They were replaced by volunteers who were there helping people. It was a whole different scene. And they turned it around. Now, that was repeated by the Americans dealing with counterfeit tickets at their World Series. And they observed the same thing, but by dealing with the ticket problem, you had a big impact on the counterfeit goods problem. But what it proves is that by having a huge awareness amongst all the different agencies, at the borders, inland, in the public mind, we could make a difference, because the importation and of non-Olympic fakes carried on as usual throughout the Olympic period. It was just on that focused on the Olympic fakes, we really had a huge impact. We had another big event, the Commonwealth Games, and we did the same there. In the Rugby World Cup, didn't quite have that intense legislative framework, but still the principles learned from the Olympics and the Commonwealth Games were put to practice, and we had a real impact on counterfeit goods. So it shows we can do it through a broad range of enforcement and well-coordinated enforcement. In Glasgow, where the Commonwealth Games were, TripAdvisor in 2011 said, this is the place to go and buy counterfeits. Anything and everything was for sale. So, we had a joint agency, everybody involved in there had one purpose, and that's to deal with Barra's market. So that we weren't shamed at the Commonwealth Games by all these counterfeits. There was some really good and persistent law enforcement. They were enforced out of that zone. Fine, but that's left a void. And what's critically important now, if we'd left it at that and patted ourselves on the back and said, what a good job we've done, we've cleared out all the counterfeits, we would have moved on to other priorities and then the criminals would have come back in. But in this case, there is a planned regeneration of the Barras. It will never be allowed to go back to that counterfeit market that it was in the first place. And that is such an important aspect of it. And it's not enforcement experts that do that, it's regeneration experts. In broadcasting, you've heard about that streaming. A real problem and a huge earner for the UK. English Premier League is known, I've been to some far-flung corners on the earth, and everybody knows English cities through English Premier League football. Now, on the illegal stream content, some of it, the sites earn their money by subscription, some of them earn it by advertising. What we do know, where the illegal content is suppressed immediately, consumers will change. In a boxing match, the illegal content, an arrangement with the ISPs, was good enough where they were switched off immediately. That's not usually possible. There's 24 hours they get to do it, but not much use on a live sporting event. But what was noticed there was consumers then wanted to watch the boxing match. The legal supply was the only one there, so they used that. So we know we can, through enforcement, affect the behaviour of consumers to do the right thing. Our dedicated police unit has taken responsibility for developing an infringing website list, which basically says to advertise, don't advertise on this website. It's an illegal website. The police take the legal liability for that, but it means that the revenue generated by those illegal sites from advertising has really been reduced. An analysis of those who persist in advertising are one, brands that really don't have good control over their advertising placement, so that can be changed. Gambling sites, and we can affect gambling sites because any company, wherever they are in the world, that has a UK internet presence is subject to regulation by the Gambling Commission. And then sites that are using those to download malware onto consumers. So there's other criminality there. But what we have done is to arrest the demand side of it. We want to work with the Chinese to stop the production of those, but our part is to deal with those who are supplying them. So recently, set-top boxes, which in themselves are not illegal, but if you're offering them for sale, knowing that they're going to be used illegally, then you come into the fraud. And so these people are going to be prosecuted for conspiracy to defraud by supplying boxes, knowing that they're going to be used for illegal purposes. And then our sports-related commodities. Well, we'll talk a bit about a particular case, and my colleague Hugh will finish that. But it's a huge problem, clothing and footwear. We've heard how it undermines rights holders and the sponsorship, but we know it's a global market. To give you an idea of where the money laundering is on that, a few years ago, an organised crime gang in the southeast of London had set up a global franchise of dealing in counterfeit golf clubs. Their golf clubs were purchased for £3 a time, and they were rebadged as high-value ones and sold on eBay for £100. So the profit margin for the criminals was huge. And the buyers were not knowingly buying counterfeits because they weren't paying a big price differential to the genuine. In less than 18 months, £3 million went through the accounts. And at the time of the arrest, £1 million was seized from the ringleader. £1 million cash. That's real money. Now, when we talk about the economic loss, some of those formulas were quite complicated. I understand the economics of that. But here's another measure. If we can demonstrate that was the money criminals made, that's the real cost of counterfeiting. And in that case, £3 million. So I'll finish my bit, and if you would just take us into where our current national priorities are and the problems that we're dealing with. Thank you.